During today's presentation, we are going to be providing an overview of DHCD and the Homeless and Special Needs Housing Unit. We are also going to provide an overview of the Housing First approach, as well as how the Housing First approach is applied to prevention, emergency shelter, and rapid rehousing programs. At the end of the presentation, as Taylor had mentioned, we are going to leave some room for the questions that you all may have or scenarios that you would like to discuss further with our staff. So to start, the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development is committed to creating safe, affordable, and prosperous communities to live, work, and do business in Virginia. The goal of the Homeless and Special Needs Housing Unit is to ensure that homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. The HSNH unit administers a continuum of state and federally funded homeless services programs to address housing and stabilization services for individuals and families at risk of or experiencing homelessness in the Commonwealth. These are the 3 grant programs that we administer. The HSNH unit administers these 3 grant programs: Virginia Homeless Solutions Program, our VHSP program, our Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS and HIV, which is our TOPWA program, and the Housing Trust Fund Homeless Reduction Grant. And in response to COVID-19, the HSNH unit is administering COVID-19 related funding through the COVID Homeless Emergency Response Program, otherwise known as CHIRP. The way we respond to homelessness is through the Emergency Crisis Response System, which is a system of services that is responsible to respond to an individual experiencing a housing crisis. Now, an emergency crisis response system works to end homelessness by aligning a community, its programs, and services around the goal of making homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. The goals of an effective crisis response system are to identify those experiencing homelessness, prevent homelessness when possible, connect people with housing quickly, and provide services when needed. An effective crisis response system achieves these goals through outreach to connect people at risk of or experiencing homelessness with coordinated entry, emergency services, and shelter. Coordinated entry to quickly identify, assess, refer, and connect people in crisis to housing assistance and services. Targeted prevention to help reduce the size of a community's homeless population. Emergency shelter and interim housing, which most people are familiar with on this call. And finally, permanent housing. So today we are talking about Housing First, the Housing First approach, and how it impacts emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and prevention programs. And we wanted to start this conversation with a very simple question: what is Housing First? Housing First is an approach to quickly and successfully connect individuals experiencing homelessness to permanent housing without any preconditions and barriers to entry, such as sobriety, treatment, or service participation requirements. Housing First operates on the idea that everyone can be housed, but some households need additional support to maintain their housing stability. Supportive services are offered to maximize housing stability and prevent returns to homelessness, as opposed to addressing predetermined treatment goals prior to exit to permanent housing. To continue with the principles of Housing First, through the Housing First approach, homelessness is first and foremost a housing problem and should be treated as such. Housing is a right that all are entitled to. Housing First operates in such a way that all people experiencing homelessness or are at risk of experiencing homelessness should be returned to or stabilized in permanent housing as quickly as possible and connected to the resources necessary to sustain that housing. Issues such as sobriety, stable mental health, etc., all of those things can be addressed once the individual or household is housed. And all services are client-driven. Housing First is about changing how communities respond to homelessness. The Housing First approach cannot be done solely through one program or even 2 programs. The Housing First approach relies on the fact that the entire community operates in this way. So communities are responsible for implementing a Housing First approach in how they are operating programs geared towards addressing homelessness. By implementing a Housing First approach, communities are able to make occurrences of homelessness rare and brief, help people experiencing homelessness obtain permanent housing quickly, help people access the care and support needed to maintain their housing and achieve a better quality of life. And these slides may seem repetitious to you all, but we really wanted to hammer home the point that Housing First is based on the premise that if people have a stable home, they will be in a better position to achieve their goals. And that while there may be other paths to an individual's recovery or creating positive changes in one's life, all of those paths start with a stable home. And now I'm going to pass it over to Taylor to take us through a few more of our Housing First approach slides. So Taylor?
Thank you, Ara. So first I want to talk about the Housing First philosophy. More specifically, I'd like to talk about what it was then and what it is now. So previously, programs did not use a Housing First philosophy, as programs were geared towards getting people housing ready. In other words, people had to earn housing by completing various programs or eliminating all their barriers, such as completing a budgeting workshop, parenting classes, getting sober, and attaining employment. Not that those programs are not beneficial. However, by requiring individuals to get housing ready before connecting them with housing, you are prolonging their stay in homelessness. The Housing First principles state that everyone is already housing ready. People should be connected with housing as soon as possible, because once they are in housing, they can address those other needs. Housing First requires that services are provided are using a harm reduction approach and motivational interviewing. All project level policies and procedures include terms that prevent lease violations and evictions. So instead of talking about being housing ready or getting housing ready or earning housing, your program should be focused on people already being housing ready and connecting them with services as soon as possible. Next slide, please. Another thing that we have seen is that programs have rules that state that participants can only reside in their shelter or other programs for 30 days. And I'm hoping that programs aren't using this exact terminology, like 30 days and you have to go, but essentially something along those lines. So Housing First indicates that people should be connected with housing from the beginning of their stay versus at that 29th day or that 30 day, then referring someone to housing. It is imperative that programs understand that the NAEH benchmarks, which is where folks typically got that 30-day goal, that those are goals rather than a hard and fast rule, because some households may take a week while others take 45 days to secure permanent housing. If you are working with clients from the beginning of their stay, rather than waiting until the end of their stay, you will have more time to help those individuals gain housing, and then also potentially free up your shelter beds earlier in the process, allowing you to help additional folks. Next slide, please. So a lot of folks will ask this question, does Housing First work? And I would hope that you all would assume that the answer is yes. Otherwise, we would not be making it a requirement of our programs and our funding. So yes, Housing First does work. It works because it reduces the number of nights that folks are staying in homelessness and connecting with people to housing sooner rather than later. Programs using the Housing First approach will have greater housing retention rates, and additionally, they will have lower returns to homelessness. Lastly, using that Housing First approach is significantly less expensive for your community as a whole than if folks are using your crisis services, such as hospitals. Individuals who are housed are less likely to create burdens on the hospital system and other crisis services now that they have a place to call home, rather than needing to use like the emergency room for various purposes to survive while experiencing unsheltered homelessness. Next slide, please. So the core components of Housing First are no programmatic prerequisites to permanent housing, low barrier admissions policies, a rapid and streamlined entry into housing, all supportive services are voluntary, and tenants have full rights, responsibilities, and legal protections. Next slide, please. So now that we've covered what Housing First is, I think it is super important that we cover what Housing First is not. So Housing First is not a free-for-all. We are not saying that you have to allow anything to happen within your program or that you have to let everyone in. It does not prohibit you from having rules or expectations of your program participants. And it is not allowing people to act in ways that are unsafe to themselves or others. And most importantly, Housing First does not state that services are voluntary for your staff. So yes, services are voluntary for your clients. However, your staff should still be actively engaging with your clients and offering services that they know will help them maintain and obtain housing. Your staff should know the value of the services that are being offered so that they can market those services to clients rather than mandating them. And so now I'll pass it back to Ara to talk to you about Housing First as it relates to our programs.
Thanks, Taylor. Before we dive into how Housing First is implemented into prevention, emergency shelter, and rapid rehousing programs, we wanted to take a brief pause to acknowledge that our programs do have requirements. These requirements do not mean that folks who present for services and do not fit the eligibility requirements are turned away from your program, but rather you perform diversion and connect them with the resources for which they are eligible for. Our requirements allow our programs to preserve the funding for those who are the most vulnerable. So we wanted to provide some background for the process of diversion. Whenever possible and safe, households experiencing a housing crisis should be diverted from entering the homeless services system. Diversion is completed by having problem-solving conversations with members of the household, linkages to mainstream resources and natural supports, and light touch financial assistance through flexible funding sources. Now let's start digging into our program, starting with targeted prevention. Again, we wanted to provide some background on targeted prevention. The crisis response system must attempt to prevent episodes of homelessness for those seeking shelter who are currently housed but at imminent risk of homelessness. With VHSP targeted prevention, communities should ensure that prevention financial assistance is targeted to households most likely to enter shelter but for the financial assistance. How are households evaluated for prevention financial assistance? First, agencies should be practicing diversion with all households. Communities should also be focusing on leveraging non-financial prevention assistance where possible to divert households from experiencing homelessness. For households that have been identified in need of financial assistance, they must meet the following criteria. They must be at imminent risk of homelessness, meaning that the person will imminently lose their primary nighttime residence within 14 days. For evidence of risk of homelessness, agencies should have the following documentation available. Agencies should have documentation of diversion in their client's files. They should also have an eviction letter from the tenant or homeowner if living with another person, i.e. if they're living in a doubled up situation, or a letter from a hotel or motel manager and canceled checks to verify costs covered by the participant, or a court order or eviction notice. In addition to the evidence of imminent risk of homelessness, the household's income should be below the 30% AMI threshold. And finally, the household has no other resources available and their assets are less than $500. And I just wanted to reiterate, your staff must practice diversion because not everyone who gets an eviction notice or a letter from a friend ends up in the homelessness system. You want to leverage those natural supports to ensure that your resources are targeted to those who are the most vulnerable and those who are most likely to experience homelessness. So how does Housing First get implemented through targeted prevention? First, services are needs-based and individualized for households. The services you're providing are based on the needs assessment that you're completing for your household. Next, your project participants are housed in quality housing. When we say quality housing, we mean habitable, not substandard housing. You're also working within the client's choice to identify the unit that meets the needs of every member of their household. A client's choice is a core principle of the Housing First approach. The identified unit is affordable for the household. And finally, the lease is under the client's name if VHSP financial assistance is used to move into a new unit. So now that we've talked about what prevention is let's dig into what prevention is not. VHSP prevention is not eviction prevention. It is not pay or quit prevention. It is not poverty prevention. Targeted prevention is not a rent and utility assistance program. And finally, VHSP prevention is not a debt relief program. When we are speaking about targeted prevention, we are focusing on the households who will experience homelessness if not for this light touch financial assistance. Again, these services are voluntary for participants, but not for staff, meaning that even though these are light touch services, staff should continue to provide housing-focused case management when necessary to ensure that the household is stable in housing. So we wanted to provide some questions for you all to evaluate your prevention programs for Housing First. So first, is diversion implemented? What are the outcomes of your diversion practices? Are the households that are served mostly households with a court-ordered eviction or doubled up? Do households served have prior instances of homelessness? How is your prevention program marketed? Do your community partners believe it's a rent assistance program, or do your partners recognize that this program is specifically geared towards those households that are most likely to experience homelessness and geared towards preventing that homelessness? So I'm going to pass it back over to Taylor to go through our emergency shelter and rapid rehousing programs. But again, we'll leave room at the end of this presentation for any questions that you all might have around diversion and prevention as well. So Taylor?
All righty, thank you. And you can go ahead and click to the next slide. Alrighty, so I'm going to talk to you guys about emergency shelter, and one of the core components to emergency shelter, especially when you're using our VHSP funds for emergency shelter, is to make sure that your shelter is low barrier. So when you're talking low barrier, we have the definition right here for you: housing where a minimum number of expectations on guests for entry and housing stabilization. So you want to make sure that you have as few barriers as possible to allow the most people to access your services. So you should be focusing on screening people into services rather than screening them out. You want to make sure that your shelter meets all the needs of the members of the household, and that you let the household self-identify if you're a family shelter. So that means if you have grandma, grandpa, and that's in the family, then that is the household as they define, and that is their family. If you have individuals of same sex and they are together, that is their family as they identify it, and that is how you would allow folks into your family shelter. You also do not want to turn people away or make access contingent upon sobriety, minimum income requirements, or lack of criminal history. And you want to make sure, and this is bare minimum, that you're providing a safe, decent, welcoming, and appropriate temporary living environment where daily needs can be met, while pathways back to safe living arrangements or directly into permanent housing can be pursued. Next slide, please. So some messaging around Housing First that you can use in your shelter. And this is stuff that if you want to put it on posters, you can do that, but also stuff that you should be using with your staff and that your staff should be using with your clients. So most folks know that how you talk to clients and how you believe things in yourself is how you see it to be true. So if you think about shelter as the end destination, that's what folks are going to be trying to achieve. But if you think of shelter as not the end destination and more so a step on your path towards getting you housed, folks will stop thinking that we have finally achieved the goal of getting shelter, because some people do have to wait a long time. So they finally get to your shelter and they're like, okay, I'm safe and this is my end goal and this is where I'm going to stay. When in reality, shelter is just a step on their pathway towards getting housed. Also being very clear to folks that you can be housed. Some folks think that because of their past or their current situation that housing is not something that is for them or something that they can attain. So making sure that your staff truly believe that they can house every person and that the person themselves knows that they can be housed. And so along with that, your staff should be talking to shelter participants at least weekly regarding housing. It should not be when they get to day 29 of their 30 days in shelter that all of a sudden you are springing this conversation about, oh, tomorrow's your last day, I hope you have an apartment. This should not be new news to people when it's like, hey, shelter was not your end goal. You should have been working with us alongside to get your permanent housing so that once you are done here, you have somewhere else to go. And all conversations should promote housing as the end goal. Next slide, please. So here we wanted to talk about some commonly seen challenges, but I don't like to talk about challenges if we don't have solutions for you, because oftentimes people point out problems, but they don't have any guidance. So here we're going to do both. We'll talk about the challenges and I'll talk about the solutions. So first, a challenge that we see is residency contingent upon sobriety. So that is an issue because at Housing First, you don't want to say, hey, like, sorry, because you may be actively using substances, you cannot come into shelter. What you can say is substances cannot be used on the premises. So this allows you to say, hey, we understand that like during the day or at other times you may be using substances, but that's not what's keeping you out of shelter. You can come in shelter, however, you cannot use substances on our premises. Another challenge that we see is residency requirements. And so we understand that certain fundings do prioritize people being in that locality. And with this being state funding, you can serve people across the Commonwealth. So a solution to that, instead of having residency requirements, would be to prioritize individuals who originate from your COC or local planning group. But that doesn't mean that you don't serve folks who are outside of that area. It means you prioritize people who are, if that's something that you would like to do, and connect folks who are not from inside your area back either to where they were from or where they'd like to go. And then if you have additional bed space and you don't have anyone from your area, you can then begin to fill your shelter with folks who do not originate from your area. Next slide, please. Alrighty, another commonly seen challenge that we have is people having programmatic requirements. So you have to attend budgeting class before we'll send your referral to rapid rehousing, or you have to attend parenting class if you choose to stay in our shelter. So instead of having those programmatic requirements, you can say all services are voluntary. However, please make sure that your staff understand the value of the services that you are offering. So instead of saying you have to attend this parenting class because that's what we've always done and that's just the rule, your staff should be saying, hey, if you're working to try to get your children back or you're working to maintain housing, this parenting class or this budgeting class may be beneficial to you, because we've seen that folks who go through this class, are able to maintain their budget better, able to pay rent on the first, these types of things. So understanding the importance of that class so that you can relay it back to your clients in order to get their buy-in to participate willingly. And then the last one that we see is exits from emergency shelters to anything other than permanent housing. So we see folks exiting people because they hit that 30 days and they're like, all right, you're going back into unsheltered homelessness. And the solution really, and most simply, is to exit people into permanent housing. So you want to have positive exits into housing. So making sure that as you are engaging with people, you were talking about securing permanent housing, whether that be shared housing, whether that be a housing of their own, certain things like that. So making sure that you're always geared towards securing permanent housing for folks as they exit your program. Next slide, please. Alrighty, and we know that society loves rules, so we're not saying that you have to have a rule-free space. And even so, what we did was we took some rules and we made some recommendations for you all. So any rule regarding harm to yourself or others, those are good rules to have, because that pretty much sums up a vast majority of the problems when we say, hey, you should use a housing first approach. Most folks are like, well, hey, like, what if people are doing X, Y, and Z? It normally boils down to a rule about harm to yourselves or others. So any rules that are in that parameter are good rules to have. The next one is treat everyone with respect and dignity. We have a lot of folks who talk about, we have shelter residents who are disrespecting the staff, or not treating the space with dignity, or treating themselves with dignity. So having a rule that's very general, treat everyone with respect and dignity, will cover a vast majority of the rules that you have that may not be housing first. The next rule is use the shelter space in a respectful manner. This is going to cover all the times where people might say, hey, like, what if someone damages the shelter? This is going to cover that for you. Another rule is no weapons allowed in the shelter, and that caveat of do not use anything in the shelter as a weapon. So this is also going to go back to don't cause harm to yourselves or others, and treat us as shelter staff and each other with respect and dignity. And then the last one, no substances are allowed on the premises. That's going to cover any of your questions and concerns around whether or not someone is allowed to actively use in the shelter. Next slide, please. Alrighty, and so the same as with targeted prevention, we're going to ask you to evaluate your shelter project. We're not asking you to do it right now, but in the future, evaluate your shelter project to make sure it is housing first. So think about what services are being provided in your shelter and what do those services accomplish. If they do not accomplish helping people achieve permanent housing, maybe you don't need them. And maybe you could use those resources towards putting it to something that is helping people achieve permanent housing. Then think about what is keeping people from accessing your shelter. Do we have any known barriers? The easiest way to figure out what barriers you have and what is keeping people from accessing your shelter is look who is coming to your shelter and look who is not. So if you realize maybe you don't have people from the LGBTQIA+ community coming to your shelter, or maybe you only have, small families coming to your shelter, look at that and kind of figure out Why are other folks not being able to come to our shelter? Are we actively putting up a barrier for that? Or maybe we have unintentionally did so by maybe the messaging around our shelter. And then again, you want to have a conversation about, when does permanent housing begin? So are you talking to people about permanent housing right when they come in, like as soon as they come in the door and they are safe and secure, you're talking about housing? Or are you waiting until it's time to exit people to talk about housing? And then what can we change to make our environment and services more housing focused? This question right here should be able to open up a conversation between you and your staff and you and your board about what services are we offering? How can we change it to make sure that housing is the end goal for all of our services? Next slide. Alrighty, so now we're going to transition into talking about rapid rehousing. Thank you. So rapid rehousing is an intervention designed to help households quickly exit homelessness and return to permanent housing. Rapid rehousing assistance is offered without preconditions. As you guys, for folks who are on Google Meets, you guys can see this very large no here. So this is no to all the things right beside it. So no income requirements, no employment requirements, no criminal background check requirements, no sobriety requirements, no program completion requirements, no ID requirements. If it is anything outside of being literally homeless, the answer is no, as it is a precondition for rapid rehousing. Next slide, please. The only criteria for rapid rehousing is an individual must be experiencing literal homelessness. And it is defined as individuals and families who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, including those residing in a shelter or place not meant for human habitation, or those exiting an institution where they resided temporarily. And something that is very huge that we need to point out is folks do not have to be in emergency shelter to receive rapid rehousing assistance. The crisis response system is not linear. So it does not mean that someone comes to coordinated entry, goes to emergency shelter, and then only through emergency shelter do they receive rapid rehousing. You can rapidly rehouse people from literal homelessness. So if your shelter is full, or your folks in outreach have a person who is ready for rapid rehousing, you can go ahead and send them through to receive rapid rehousing assistance. You do not have to wait until a bed space opens up in shelter in order to refer them to rapid rehousing. Okay, let some folks in, sorry y'all. All right, so housing first as it pertains to rapid rehousing. We recognize that folks may have several barriers that need to be addressed. However, these barriers should be addressed as you work to secure permanent housing and should not be used as a hindrance to assisting folks with securing housing, i.e. you should not postpone looking for units because an individual does not have employment. Work to secure employment while simultaneously working to secure housing. Rapid rehousing is a short-term crisis intervention and is not a long-term subsidy. Therefore, you should be working with households to secure the necessary resources to maintain their housing as soon as possible. Work to secure the housing first, and then rapidly work to help them maintain and said housing by connecting them with all the resources that they need, which is employment, SNAP benefits, etc. Rapid rehousing services should also be individualized, and they need to be light touch. So every household is different, every individual is different, their situations may be different. So work to individualize how you work with that person to fit their needs, and give the lightest touch financial assistance possible to help them obtain and maintain housing so that you have additional assistance to help other families. And then recertification. It is required that you recertify folks every 3 months for financial assistance, and case management needs to be recertified every 12 months. You should be working with households to secure those necessary resources to maintain their housing and checking on them monthly and quarterly to make sure that you meet these requirements. Next slide, please. All right, so project participants or your clients should be housed in quality housing. It should be habitable. It needs to be the client's choice. It should be affordable so that they can maintain this housing, and the lease should be under the client's name. Next slide. And lastly, we'd like you to evaluate your rapid rehousing project. So you can ask these questions when you're talking about your rapid rehousing project. You can talk about this with your board, your staff, etc. So evaluate your rapid rehousing project to make sure you are using a housing first approach. Is diversion being implemented? What are the outcomes to that diversion? Are the households required to have income, be sober, have IDs, all of that before they come into your program or before the housing assistance is provided? When do we talk to people about housing? How are people being referred to the program? Are your referring partners requiring individuals to have all these barriers resolved before referring to households? If this is a big one because we have folks who will say, oh, well, maybe my referring partner doesn't send that referral until the person has income, has their ID, all of these types of things. So maybe my specific program doesn't have barriers, but my referring partner does. So that means that your rapid rehousing program is not housing first because people are not being able to even come to you or even access your programs because they have barriers at the entry door. So making sure that you talk to your partners about, hey, we work with people to secure employment, benefits, IDs as we work to secure their housing. And then lastly, how do we market this program to landlords? Are you actively engaging with your landlords regularly to talk about the program, to kind of build a partnership so that they will accept your clients, maybe if they don't have all the things that are necessary? So these are just some things that you can talk to your board, your staff, et cetera, when you're evaluating your rapid rehousing program. Let's see here. All right, so that is the conclusion of the presentation. We're now going to open up the floor to questions. If you would like, you can unmute yourself, and if you're on the phone, that's *6. Or if you'd like, we are also monitoring the chat feature, so you can drop your chats or your questions in the chat, and we will answer them in the order that they're coming through. Alrighty here. So I see a question. Is there still a waiver for the 3-month recertification? If I am not mistaken, that waiver has ended, but let me double check. Do not quote me on that.
Taylor, that waiver ends next March.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you, Kendall. Alrighty.
So this is Kathy from Fajas. I have a question. In our COC, of course, HOPWA, we get HOPWA funding, and other members of our COC do the rapid rehousing thing. And so far, we've not been able to coordinate, even though we don't have rapid rehousing. We do have PHP, but it's not quite the same. It seems like if we try to get a client on the rapid rehousing list, there's such a long list in our area. Is there a plan to allow HOPWA to have some kind of similar rapid rehousing program in the future ever?
I can take part of that, Taylor. So that is a 100% federally funded program. We follow the HUD guidelines. There are pieces of it that can operate a little bit more closely like that. But I would say, well, one, work with your program admin and we can talk about more of what's needed. But two, DHD is bringing on someone that's going to be helping specifically with HOPWA to make sure that we are expanding the guidelines as much as possible to meet the needs of the service providers and the individuals that they serve. And so if there's not flexibility that we've already written into the guidelines, we're going to be looking to see if we can open those up to really, serve you all and the clients as best possible. But I would say go ahead and contact your program admin and let's talk about it more.
And that was Kathy from Fajas, correct?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Kathy, I'll reach out to you so we can start working with your COC lead as well to kind of figure that out. Alrighty, let's see here. We do have a couple more questions. So how can we get a copy of this recording? As soon as we are done here, we will go ahead and get that uploaded onto the website. It may take us a couple of days, but as soon as it's uploaded, we will go ahead and send that out to everyone.
Taylor, did you see the, I think it's more like a comment, but also like a recommendation request. Any recommendation for dealing with clients who continue to turn down housing options offered to them? And, I can take a part of this. being a direct service provider, I've seen that a lot. So honestly, this goes back to that piece that services are voluntary for clients, but not necessarily for your staff. I recognize that it's a frustrating process when you see your clients or households, refusing or declining certain housing options, but this is your opportunity to explore why they decline those housing options and sort of gear your focus towards finding an option that's suitable for the household. Allow your clients and your households to be the owner of their own narrative and be able to define for you what they need. So that's my recommendation, is to, even though the services are voluntary for clients, your staff is still required to continuously offer housing. Again, recognizing that it could be potentially a frustrating process. You could offer 40 times to your clients, and on that 41st time, they might be like, okay, let's do it this time. That's my recommendation. Taylor or team, do you all have any other additional thoughts?
I think you said it perfectly. Do you want to grab the next question regarding how does Housing First apply to PSH?
Sure. It does. Short answer, Housing First is applied to all programs. It is an approach. It is required for folks to enter programs. It's a requirement for your staff to implement, to ensure that you have equitable access for all clients and households who are experiencing homelessness. So in terms of PSH, you're still allowing for that client choice. You're still individualizing your services towards the needs of the household. You're not imparting any sort of specific programmatic requirements. And while PSH does have some additional services that are attached to it, like additional case management, additional support services, things like that, you are still offering those on a voluntary basis for your clients. So, but again, sort of going to Taylor's point earlier with rapid rehousing, your programmatic services should be so successful that clients will want to engage with your staff, or they will ask additional questions about what programs that you have in your program. So that's just a sort of short nitty gritty of, yes, Housing First is applied to PSH, it's applied to all programs. Again, if I missed anything, feel free to jump in. I'm sort of looking to my team to, if I did miss anything.
All right, I think you covered it perfectly. And I'll get this next question from Katrina. Can we assist clients in rapid rehousing with VHSP funds outside of the county the funds were granted in? The answer is yes. These are state funds. You can help folks across the Commonwealth of Virginia. However, what I would recommend you do is working with your program administrator and the community partners to the community that you are planning on housing that person in, because maybe we can strike up a partnership where one of you guys does the case management and the initial assistance, or vice versa, so that you guys are splitting the burden between the two. And also maybe you won't have to drive so far to do that move-in inspection if there's already a rapid rehousing provider in that community. So to the next one. Alrighty, and then next question, what are your thoughts around connecting people to affordable housing and sustainability in a community that has a lack of affordable housing and a high cost of living for those served? Kendall, do you want to grab this one?
Apologies, Taylor, can you repeat the question?
Of course I can. What are your thoughts around connecting people to affordable housing and sustainability in a community that has a lack of affordable housing and high cost of living for those served?
I'd say it's a struggle everywhere, regardless of if it's a high income area or a lower income area. I do want to drop this, that Virginia has received an allocation of American Rescue Plan funding that's going to be going through the HOME program. And right now we are working to create a guide or a goal for how this is going to be utilized in Virginia. So the money that's going to be received is going back out into communities to help create affordable housing opportunities, specifically for persons impacted by homelessness, either currently exiting homelessness or who have been previously homeless. So watch out for that. But otherwise, there are lots of programs that are getting really creative. And I don't know if Megan is on here, but Megan Cotter is just a guru with how to make the roommate situation work. That's been, I mean, they've done incredible work up in Fredericksburg, Virginia on stretching really small incomes over a high priced or high cost of rent area. So I would say, again, it's an opportunity to contact your housing program admin, and we could get in touch with some other providers that are doing some other creative things, but also keep an eye out for some opportunities for affordable housing development projects in your area.
Kendall, can I add to sort of what you were saying? I think this is a good question because I mean, it's exactly what Kendall said. This is something that's experienced across the nation, not just unique to Virginia. So I think this is an opportunity for you all within your community and working with your community partners to really assess, the housing resources that are currently in your community, what you can do to leverage other resources. We do work very closely with our affordable and special needs housing side of our GHCD shop. So we are already having those conversations. So the recommendation is for you all to have those conversations with your community partners as well. And if you're, struggling to have buy-in from the localities, for example, you might want to continue to leverage your partnership that you have within your COC, within your local planning groups, to those locality partners to say, look, this isn't just X service provider. This isn't just me that's experiencing this. We're all experiencing this as a need. So we need to address this on the larger level beyond our COC. We need to leverage our relationships with our locality, with our local governments to ensure that we're right sizing the housing resources for our community members. That's my recommendation. Again, I'm with the Balance of State COC, so I sort of look at things a little bit more systemically, but that's just one recommendation for you all to take back to your community partners.
All righty, thank you, Ara, for getting that one. And then let's see here, another question. Can clients qualify for prevention services if a client's lease is ended and their landlord does not want to renew their lease, which may lead them to be at risk of homelessness? So if their lease is ending, you'll want to still have that diversion conversation around what other resources they have. And if they are going to fall into homelessness within 14 days, you'll still want to be able to document that and make sure, obviously, they meet all other criteria for prevention services. And then, Beth, I think what you're talking about here is what if it puts us out of the 30 days to house window? That 30 days is a goal rather than a hard and fast rule. So the goal is on average for you to get people to secure permanent housing within 30 days. However, if a client takes 31 days or 45 days, mind you, it's an average. So some folks get housed a little quicker, some folks do not. It is a goal versus if you don't receive housing in 30 days, you must exit. That's not the goal here. I think we have covered all the questions in the chat. If anyone has any additional questions, feel free to drop them in there. Or again, you can unmute yourself. And if you're on the phone, that is *6. All right, so we did get another question. So does that mean that clients can remain in search mode for housing indefinitely? Technically, yes, that is what that means. They could stay in that housing search mode for quite some time. However, you want to make sure that you're working with your case managers, housing locators to kind of figure out what the root of that issue is, so that you can try to get them into permanent housing. All right, Sheila, what is the correct process for home inspections before housing someone? So I'm assuming that you're referring to completing that DHCD basic habitability checklist, that lead-based paint visual assessment and such. Most people go ahead before you sign the lease, and obviously before you hand over that financial assistance, you send out your housing navigator, case manager, home inspector, various different titles for folks. You have them go out to the unit and complete that walkthrough with the landlord first and go through all of the documents. And if you're doing it virtually, some folks are sending over the documents to the landlord first, and getting photos and things of that nature, but still those need to have actual signatures on those documents. And you do all of that first, and then once that is complete, then you can have your client sign the lease if they so choose and hand over that financial assistance second. All right, someone said HQS. Our funding does not require that you are HQS inspected. We do require that you do the DHCD basic habitability checklist, lead-based paint, fair market rent, rent reasonable, all the various things that are listed in the guidelines. Other funding does, however, require that you are HQS inspected. So if your funding does require that, please make sure you know that and that you are doing the appropriate HQS inspections. I won't speak on what it all entails because I'm not HQS certified. However, please reach out to your appropriate funding source if that is what you require. Aura, did you want to speak on the HMIS question that we had previously regarding when to enroll folks?
Sure. So what we've heard from some communities is that they do not enroll individuals or households into their rapid rehousing projects that are in HMIS until they have all the documentation for a permanent housing unit. We do not recommend this. We recommend that you enroll someone into your rapid rehousing project that's in HMIS right at the start of when they are deemed eligible for the rapid rehousing services. This is where you're going to capture a lot of your case notes along the way of where the client is at and getting the appropriate documentation that landlords are requiring. But from our perspective, you should not be barring people from entering your services if they do not have those programmatic like the previously stated, like programmatic requirements that Taylor had mentioned on one of our slides, which was the income requirement, ID requirement, sobriety requirements, things like that. You do not, you want to make sure that you enroll individuals into your program regardless of any of those requirements that might be listed out by landlords, or if that landlords that might have questions around. You want to make sure that these folks are linked to your services right when they're determined eligible. And another question that's in the chat, Taylor, is a housing navigator an eligible expense for emergency shelter?
Housing navigator is not eligible under emergency shelter. However, it is eligible under housing location cost under rapid rehousing, and trying to get the correct terminology for what we call it. Housing search and placement, there we go. So if you have folks who are in emergency shelter, but then you connect them with rapid rehousing and they are in that housing search process, you would be billing that housing navigator under your rapid rehousing program. Under emergency shelter, you would just be able to bill your case management and your housing focused case management. All right, an additional question. Since COVID, landlords are raising the bar for income and credit histories at an alarming rate. This is contributing to the lack of affordable housing. Any suggestions? So this is something that we are seeing across the state. And one of the things that we have is under CHIRP, we do have landlord incentives, and they should be utilized when households cannot achieve housing because of these types of things. So if they have bad credit, and the landlord needs to be incentivized in order to give them the unit. But make sure that you're using these rare and like only when you absolutely have to, because we still want to make sure that you are doing as light a touch financial assistance as possible. But however, getting creative in those conversations with your landlord, such as double security deposits or using the landlord incentives that you can do under CHIRP specifically. And then another creative solution, which is not necessarily creative, but folks who have never had to do it before are now getting into the game of shared housing because the rents are going up so much. So folks who may have not used shared housing before because they didn't want to have to figure out how to manage like roommate situations are now getting into that game in order to figure out how to manage the higher rents for folks, which is a good idea because now you can house maybe 2 clients instead of 1 in a unit instead. Indeed, it is. It is hard for families to share. So still making sure that if shared housing is the option that you're suggesting, it is an option that the family is choosing and not one that you're forcing on them. Let's see here. All right, Felicia said shared housing is working very well for her clients and her landlord, so that's good, positive information. And then we have a question, in roommate situations, do they need separate leases? It is ideal for folks to have separate leases so that if something happens with one person, that does not affect the entire household or both clients or both families. So if you can get 2 leases or however many leases that you need for the unit, it is ideal. And then that way, if you have one household exit out of the unit, then maybe your landlord would be open to you placing a different household. But no, it is not required. We have folks who go on the same leases all the time. All right. Oh, thank you, Felicia. So Felicia is saying that they are also doing subleasing with the owner's approval. So yes, so be mindful if you're doing subleasing that it is something that the landlords are okay with. Some leases do have that clause that you cannot sublease. So making sure, excuse me, that you are having that conversation with the landlord and looking at the leases.
I'm just reading Kathy's comment around HOPWA clients, and that's completely right. You're still looking to protect your clients' health information. So if you're discussing a shared roommate situation, you do want to be mindful of maintaining confidentiality, right? And I mean, Kathy, also what you said about many clients with fixed income can't afford anything but a roommate situation. I think that's very true and very telling of the current situation that we're in across the nation, again, about affordable housing these days. I mean, just as a heads up, I don't know if necessarily I could afford my space without having a roommate as well. So just to level set that a little bit more, this is not something that's only impacting our clients, but our clients do feel the repercussions of this issue and challenge that exists more so than we might feel. I just wanted to make that comment really quick and address what Kathy had said.
Appreciate you. Okay, next question. If you have a client who does not have any income source and you house them with funding for a year and they still don't have any income after that year, where is the funding going to come from so that they can remain housed or would they be sent to shelter? So the only way that the person is going back into shelter is if they become literally homeless, then you would have to send them back to shelter. However, if you're using VHSP funds, the maximum is 24 months in a 3-year period for financial assistance versus if you're using Housing Trust Fund. And so on a regular basis, you're going to be checking in with this client about their income and working on trying to get them to increase how much they're paying towards the rent so you can decrease how much you're paying towards the rent. So hopefully you don't get to a whole year without income, and also reminding them that there are term limits on how much financial assistance can be provided. And most folks, if you run out of funding before you get to that term limit with this person, like you would want to have them actively engage in that conversation because funding may not be guaranteed for them. Alrighty, so I think we've answered all the questions. So what we can do, we'll hang back a couple more minutes, but if no one has any additional questions, we thank you all for taking the time to do this Housing First training with us. Again, it is recorded, and so we will make it available within the next couple of days. I believe it is going to go up on our website, so you'll be able to share this as far and as wide as you would like. If you have additional questions or need to dig deeper into your program specifically, please reach out to your program administrator. So as of right now, that'd be myself or Will Kerner or Rashonda Lanier Jackson. And either one of us could help you dig deeper into your programs and figure out whether or not you are housing first. So again, just thank you all for taking the time to be with us today.
Hello, ladies. I do have one question. Hey, this is Tanya from SSRC. Let's say for some reason or another, we do use rapid rehousing for a client, and something happens to where they are evicted or something happens with the housing. Are we able to rapid rehouse again, pay another deposit, or to get them housed again within the same fiscal year, or does that even matter?
So as long as the person is still open and enrolled in your rapid rehousing program, you can continue to assist them. However, if they have been closed out of your rapid rehousing program and now they are like they've gotten that eviction notice, they are 14 days or less to homelessness, they would now be prevention eligible rather than rapid rehousing eligible. Now, if they fall all the way into homelessness, now we're talking about like emergency shelter. And their eligibility would be new, so therefore bringing them back into services would be like starting all over.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, and I think we did miss one more question. Will any funding be made available for transitional housing? We do not have funding for transitional housing, and since we are continuing to work towards that housing first approach and securing permanent housing, that is why we are putting all of our money towards like rapid rehousing projects and programs. As transitional housing continues to keep people into homelessness for prolonged periods of time, we focus on trying to get people into their own units and permanent housing as fast as possible. And additional question, how does Housing First work for a temporary homeless shelter? So you still want to be having those same connections with, or same conversations, my apologies, while you have folks in your temporary shelter. So even if it is like a winter shelter, getting folks connected to rapid rehousing as fast as possible when patients around. This is not your end goal, and connecting that way. And yes, somebody asked if we'll put it on the website, and yes, indeed, it will go on the website as well, or the recording.